Hey everybody, today is Monday, July 29th, 2024. Coming up on the show today, from Twisters, editor Terilyn Shropshire.
That's when things got interesting because then we came back and I really started working on it, but we didn't have everything. And it wasn't like we didn't have everything from Reel 5. There was every single reel had something that we needed. With the visual effects department, I think sometimes there is this kind of, we're visual effects and they're editorial, and there's, I don't want to say any kind of us against them, but there is this sense of division on this one that was not going to work for me. I mean, I don't want to sound trite, but I feel like we built a family in Twisters and I miss them every day.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. All right, who's up for some talk about editing and incredibly talented editors? You, I hope, because that's what we're here to do on the podcast. Here we are, a third of the way through the Northern Hemisphere summer already, and you can tell that we are because the movies are of the summer blockbuster variety. You need proof? Okay, how about Twisters? Conveniently the movie we are talking about today. Sure, it's got all the earmarks of a summer blockbuster, including the box office receipts of a huge opening weekend, but none of that's really important. What's important, to us anyway, is that it has a fantastic editor who I always enjoy speaking with. That is, of course, Terilyn Shropshire. Teri is making her third appearance on the show today. She's been on before to talk about Cutting the Old Guard and The Woman King, both big action movies with strong female protagonists. Twisters is kind of the same way, but this time a lot of the action comes in the form of visual effects. Certainly practical effects as well, I'm sure. But how was Twisters different for Teri compared to The Old Guard and The Woman King, where most of the action was right there in the dailies just waiting for her to work her editorial magic? Well, we should ask her. We should ask her a lot of things, and we will. But first, let's have a little bit of summertime fun with our pals and sponsor Extreme Music. Now, you know the drill already. Extreme Music is the leading provider of production audio for film and TV makers who are in the know. You should be in the know. Technically, now you are, because I just told you. And before I tell you any more, let's dial up a little background music. Something bouncy and fun. You know what? I'm not even going to dial. I'm just going to go with a track from an artist they are featuring on their homepage. Here we go. Yep, that'll work nicely. But maybe this isn't what you need for your project. Not a problem. They have a massive catalog of tracks that you can search through using keywords like tempo, genre, lyrics, composer, even words like bouncy and fun. And do not forget to try their reference track technology that uses their artful intelligence to find you tracks like a reference track you give to them. Either way you go, you can customize the tracks you get back. Take this track here that we're listening to now. It had vocals. They were great, but I didn't want them competing with my beautiful voice. So I just went into the stem mixer right there on the webpage and took them out. So fast, so fun, and so easy for you to do the licensing right there on the web, or with one of their friendly reps from around the world. So the next time you're feeling bouncy and fun, go get your production audio from the best of the best, Extreme Music. Speaking of the best, it's time to talk Twisters with Teri. Please welcome back to the podcast, editor Terilyn Shropshire. Talk to you when we schedule an actual interview. Every time I see you, we don't get to talk.
That's true.
This is not meant to be. You know, it's funny. So often when I do these interviews, just like with you, I've already been conversing with the editor for a while they're on the job or about to start the job, so that by the time the movie finally comes out, it feels like they've been on it forever, and maybe it does to you too. So let's try and put some parameters around the production and post timeline of Twisters. When did you start and when did you finish? And was there a bit of a hiccup in there due to the strike?
Yes. Well, I met Isaac. I still remember the first time we met was around January 19th because we were both mentors in the Academy Gold program. And I had gone to the Academy for our little orientation, and he was also there with his mentee. So we met in January 2023. And it was crazy. I have to say, it's one of those meetings where you're like, when people say there are no coincidences, that there's no accidents. You were just going to an orientation, and because you were starting the whole thing. And we got grouped in, they try to do these icebreakers where they get a few of you together. And what do you guys, name one thing you guys all have in common? So after all of that, the little mentees went running off. I felt like a parent as they went running off to take their pictures. And Isaac and I just started talking, kind of like, oh, what are you up to? What are you up to? And he was very complimentary about the Woman King. And of course, I was like, oh my gosh, Minari. So I said to him, so what are you up to? And he said, well, you have to know Isaac because he's just, he's amazing. He's just so nonchalant. He said, yeah, so I'm starting pre-production on a film. And I said, oh, what film? And he said, Twister. And I said, Twister? Like Twister? And he laughed. He said, yeah. He said, but it's not a sequel. It's a standalone revisit of the film. And I'm kind of excited. And I'm like, yeah, it sounds great. So, chit chat. And he says, it's really interesting that I'm meeting you this way here. And I said, well, why is that? He said, well, my editor, Harry Yoon for Minari, he's not going to be available to work on this. And you were one of the people, he gave me your name, that we should meet. And the fact that we were just like in this random, but maybe not so random environment, like the universe put us together. And so at the end of the evening, he said, if you're interested in reading the script, and I said, I would love to read the script. And I followed up with him the next day saying, it was great meeting you. And when you have something that you'd be open to me reading, I'm really excited. About a week and a half later, he sent me the script and I, of course, inhaled it right away. I watched it right away. As I say, I watch my scripts. And then we set up a time to meet. We went and had coffee. We talked for a couple of hours. And at the end of it, he said, well, I'd like to work with you on this, which, I was just so, I was so excited. It was just so great to talk to him, and nothing better than sitting down with the director and being able to kind of talk story and the script. Those are the kind of conversations I love to have, especially early. And then I started working with them about 6 weeks out, maybe a little bit more on previs and going in for meetings. And then we were in Oklahoma end of April. They started shooting early May. It was a total of 60 days, but we did about 2.5 weeks before we were wrapping actors' strike hit. And so we had to stop. That's when things got interesting because then we came back and I started putting together, obviously I was putting together a cut while I was on location in Oklahoma, but then we really started working on it, but we didn't have everything. And it wasn't like we didn't have everything from reel 5. There was every single reel had something that we needed still to have. And at the same time, we were also right down the hall from visual effects who had handed us a calendar saying, these are when we need these shots. We need this many shots delivered by this date. So like the first week we got back, okay, we need 100 shots. The next week was like 100 shots. The next week was 200, so in that way, it was incredibly challenging because what you didn't have in what hadn't been shot was being filled out by storyboards and previses. And so it was a lovely, strange looking film as I started to cut this thing because we had to wait. And then once the strike was over, we zoomed back over to Oklahoma. We got there, I think, end of November, and it ended up being another 3 weeks, I think. And then it got really interesting. We also knew that Universal was not going to move the release date. So the schedule where you kind of wanted to feel like it was going this way. At a certain point, it just felt like you were in the Star Wars trash compactor where you were like, okay, release date. And it was like, oh my God.
There's a bit of a silver lining where the editors or the filmmakers will say, you know what, having that break and be able to come back and look at it with fresh eyes did help us solve some problems we just weren't able to get over previously. But if they don't move the release date, that is just going to be a ton of pressure.
Yeah. But what I will say about it was that the work that we did leading up to going back, it was a combination of doing what you would normally do within the gestation and process of the film and finding the film and fine-tuning the film and concentrating the film. And then, again, there was so much unknown as to the things we didn't have and trying to kind of modulate as much as you could that. But I really felt like when we got back to Oklahoma the second time, the crew was so focused, every department, and almost everybody came back and everybody was happy to be back. And I think that there was a sense of purpose, especially with respect to the love and regard for Isaac, because his leadership is just incredible. I've said this before that if you opened up a visual dictionary and looked up the word unflappable, Isaac's photo would be right there. And he was just such a tremendous leader and supportive, and just everybody wanted to be there and deliver this thing for him.
You described this as, I think you said standalone sequel. I've heard it a few times as a spiritual sequel. I caught the cameo of Bill Paxton's son, and then there's the Dorothy Science Project thing. Other than that, are there any actual connections to the original that I missed?
I think Dorothy, Bill Paxton's son, by the way, Mark L. Smith's daughter is his girlfriend in the motel scene. Yeah. So we had some of our talented young people representing their dads. So I would say no, except, and Isaac's talked about this, the visual effects team throughout the process loved to sneak in references to bovine in the film within the visual effects. And usually Isaac would catch it and say, we're not going to do that. But we do have one flying bovine, but you have to look really hard for it.
So in preparation for Twisters, Isaac talked about revisiting certain films, Jaws for one, and then films like War of the Worlds and The French Connection and Gone in 60 Seconds. Did he talk about any of those films with you and how they relate to Twisters?
We talked about Jaws a lot, especially when it came to the Twisters and the unseen nature, how a character moves through fear, but also fear of what they can't see. We named them by T1 through T5. The Tornado 1, a lot of it was that they were being chased by something that they couldn't quite see. And then when we go back into Tornado 5, that's how it kind of hits, right? And so we talked a lot about that as very much that's what Jaws was, right? The fear of what was beneath you until you could finally see it. So that was, I think, in many ways, the Jaws reference. It was funny because there were moments, especially as it applied to Kate, that I had certain memories of contact. And just that idea of kind of being in that space where you go out on your own and seemingly to save the day, that kind of heroine who I always just remember that moment when, the whole thing's shaking and it's about to fall apart and she's trying to tell them that she's okay. And there are moments when we talked about that movie as well. Isaac is such a lover of film and a student of it and a teacher of it. He was a teacher. So he really channels a lot of films that have touched him in many ways.
So for any project, there's going to be a certain amount of pressure because you're working on big films with a lot of expectations placed on them. In this case, though, big summer blockbuster, Steven Spielberg, director who is new to you. Anything different about that for you, whether it's the way you approach it or anything that you had to do differently to prep for it because of the scope and scale and magnitude of this kind of film?
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about that because I find that when I approach a film, I kind of come from a space of feeling as if every film I work on, I try to kind of create a bit of a bubble around me and the work so that the noise of what the enormity of it is in some ways kind of stays at a distance, because I know, and every editor you would talk to would say, every film has basic needs. Whether you're working on a $1 million movie or you're working on a $100 million movie, there's just a certain degree of attention and love and patience and persistence and protection that you need to build around it so that it doesn't become exceedingly overwhelming, or you don't let that noise affect what really has to get done or what this entity needs just to start the growth. Of course, yes, when you have more resources, you're able to kind of move through things a lot easier. It can be less of a struggle. But the pressure itself, what I try really hard to do in the editing room is to keep that outside the editing room, especially for the director and especially for someone who is getting that anyway. Like, when Isaac goes out and he shoots and he's got a crew of thousands, that are coming at him, what I really like to try to do is when he gets into the cutting room, that it's just the two of us and the story and all of it. Now, on something like this, you've got visual effects who start as early as you do, if not before. You have the sound team at Skywalker was with us at the very beginning, thank goodness. So you have that support system, but you do have more people kind of knocking at your door going, come on, we need this. So there were just times when Isaac and I knew that we would need to kind of close the door, and we knew that they were outside and waiting for us to deliver, and we were going to deliver, and we made every deadline. I was so proud of us that we never kept them waiting. We gave them what they needed, but then we were like, okay, now you need to give us some time to build the foundation around the spectacle that you're creating. So there was always the need of feeding the spectacle, feeding that machine. But it was also essential for the two of us to have that time together to work on Kate, to work on all the characters, to get the story right, and make sure that that was something so that ultimately around these amazing tornadoes, that people who watch this movie were going to care. They were going to move through it and they were going to care. And so the pressure certainly came in waves, because when you're trying to kind of do all of this, and then at a certain point, the studio is going to want to see it and you're going to want to show it to them in the best possible way. And at the same time, we don't have all the footage. And so then there was also that sense of, once the strike was ending, knowing that I was going to lose Isaac, not lose him, but that we were all going to have to kind of shift gears back to production. And so I was still cutting, right? But I was also having to prep and start to give people the information they would need to go back out, because they were shooting new things. We were grabbing things like pickups and inserts and that kind of thing. But there was a lot of information that these crews now needed after 5 months. Now we had a movie. It was no longer the script. Now we had enough of the movie where we could inform them as to, okay, this is what things are looking at. This is what we're really going to need here. So it was kind of an all hands on deck when we went back. And so there was that pressure, like, we got to get it right. We got to get everything we need. That's the other thing, was making sure that when we did go back to Oklahoma, we were getting everything we needed, because there wasn't going to be like this opportunity to, do this again. And we had a release date, and visual effects was like jamming. So it's those kinds of pressures. And certainly when we got back from Oklahoma, and then there was like, now I had everything, I had to prepare the film. Because if you think about it, up until December, Isaac had never seen his entire film. He had seen what he had shot and what we had cut together, mixed in with previews and storyboards. But it wasn't really until when we got back, and then we were immediately going into hiatus for the holidays, I really had to build quickly a version of the film so he could actually sit down and watch his film for the first time. And then shortly after that, we knew we were going to have to present it to the studio. So that's when it got really intense, I think, for me. Sometimes I still ask myself how I got through it, but part of getting through it was having someone like Isaac say to me, because there were times I would say to him, how are you feeling? Do you feel like that we have enough time here? Do you feel like you have the time you need? We had the conversation, and he would just say every day, let's see how we do today. That's how he approached our process when we got back, was we just start in the morning and we would see how far we got every day. And I really appreciated that kind of support and advocacy, because he really did want the two of us to get through it together.
So that was a very fun story about the somewhat chance meeting you had with Isaac and the connection to Harry Yoon. So you're working with Isaac for the first time. I think for the most part, certainly as lead editor, this is also the first time you're working with the other department heads in a situation like that, or maybe on any movie. Is there sort of a formal introduction between department heads, or a meeting where you all get together to discuss the film as a whole? Or is that really more of a siloed, well, I'm in editorial, they're over in sound, they're over in visual effects, composition, things like that?
It's interesting, because I feel like as HODs, in some ways, we bring the baggage from our previous films, in terms of the way people worked or worked in the past. For me, I'm always wanting to work in a collaborative environment. That's just the way I've come through. And fortunately, I've had some healthy collaborative environments with other departments. So I felt on this one that we all got along really, really well. I think in some ways, I tried to foster as much we're in this together kind of situation. And I want to give you guys what you need. So for me, the communication of it was essential. I feel like in any kind of relationship, there's always a warming up and kind of getting to know who everybody is and what their personalities are. And I feel like this film was no different, except that what was great was just our proximity to each other. Like for me, working with the visual effects team and ILM and Ben Snow, Ben was our visual effects supervisor. Mark Soper was our visual effects producer, and Bennett worked on the first one. And a lot of it was those early conversations and just being in the room during the discussions, which were incredibly helpful for me. And Isaac really encouraged me to kind of be in the room as much as possible, even during pre-production when they were still in LA. I would be in the offices when they had these meetings because obviously it was going to inform. And I think that with the visual effects department, I think sometimes there is this kind of, we're visual effects and they're editorial, and there's, I don't want to say any kind of us against them, but there is this sense of division on this one that was not going to work for me. And I think that as we work together more and more, by the end of the film, we were having visual effects reviews almost every day because that's how quickly things were coming through. And we definitely had them at least twice a week during production. And I think that that really fostered a sense of this unified collective goal, which I really loved. But there are moments when I wondered, did it take a minute for visual effects to warm up to me? Or was it just that kind of, maybe it happens like that more on other films. But for me, I'm kind of like, I want everybody working together. And I think this was an extraordinary experience. And I feel like I learned so much from them. And I hope that they took away something from working with me. I mean, I don't want to sound trite, but I feel like we built a family in Twisters, and I miss them every day. We had this editing room where people had their dogs, and Isaac's dog Comet became our mascot. He'd be jumping over everybody in the visual effects reviews. And it was a great team. And it had to be. I mean, we had to kind of really come together to get through this. Films say that all the time, I'm sure, in comparison. But, when you're going through some kind of unique experience, but it's a collectively unique experience, it's either going to divide you or you guys are going to get stronger and come together. And that's what happened with us.
What necessitated you being on location in Oklahoma? Was it because of the visual effects nature of the film, or just the way Isaac liked to work, the way you like to work? What made it necessary for you to be there?
All of it. I feel that once we got to Oklahoma, and I basically brought my first assistant, Corinne Villa, my wing gal extraordinaire, and then we had our second assistant, Jesse Lee, there, and Warren Hickman, our VFX editor. And then we had an Oklahoma PA, Josh Romer, and then I could talk about the crew when we got back. But specifically in Oklahoma, I think that part of it was that Isaac and our DP, Dan Mendel, they decided they wanted to shoot on film. Dan is someone who wants to, and I love him for it. Both he and Isaac wanted to screen dailies. We actually had daily screenings at lunch every day or after wrap. When they were on location, we had a dailies trailer. So part of it was that, but I think part of it was the immediacy of being able to communicate with the crews, the first unit, second unit. We had obviously a C unit. There were drones. There were all kinds of things happening. And the immediacy of being there to support the needs of the film, I think, were essential. I mean, visual effects, everybody was there. So it didn't make sense for me or our team not to be there, because ultimately everything they're doing affects us. Not to mention, this is the first film that I used QTake on, which is an app where I was able to be working. And we were working at Prairie Surf Studios in Oklahoma City, downtown. And so they were building a lot of the sets at Prairie Surf, but then they were also going out, obviously, on location. On this film, there was a number of times where second unit was going out before first unit, just because of the nature of the schedule. And so with Q-Take, I literally felt as if I was on the Starship Enterprise, where I'm literally editing and I have monitors set up where I'm watching what first unit's doing. I'm watching what second unit's doing. At times I'm communicating with second unit production manager about something, or I'm looking at what first unit's doing. I'm preparing segments for first unit that second unit did, so that they can have a sense of what second unit did for them, or vice versa. First unit shoots something, second unit's following, and I'm cutting so that they can see what first unit did. So I feel like I can't do that from 2,000 miles away. I mean, I could try, but I felt that on something like this, it was essential. And plus, you want to provide a support system for the director. Obviously, he has a lot of that around him in production, but there were times when Isaac would just take a break between takes or something, or if they were moving the camera around between shots, he would just come to the editing room and we would talk, or he'd say, "Oh, can you show me this?" And I would show him something. Or if he was prepping, if he was shooting a scene that I had already cut the scene before, there was just a lot of ability for him to just come in, sometimes to watch, sometimes to talk. I could walk over to him. I just love being there because I feel like people sometimes don't realize how much editorial can help during the production process. We're not just sitting there waiting for film to come in, because ultimately I want to be able to inform any of the filmmakers that are working in service to ultimately all the footage that I'm going to be responsible for. I want to help them see and know and have an awareness of where the film's going, how it's cutting, what might we need. I don't know. It's just this desire of trying to be as proactive all the time as possible.
Q-Take has come up a few times on the show before. I know editor Paul Matchless is a big proponent of it. For people listening that don't quite know what Q-Take is, could you explain exactly what it does on set for you?
What's amazing about Q-Take is, and it's an app, and basically what you're doing is you're getting the feed from the video assist operators on set. So whatever they're feeding the monitors over in Video Village, for whether the director or whoever's sitting, producers or whatever they're seeing in real time, I'm also seeing. And that goes for both first unit and second unit. Any unit that has a ability to have a video assist, I can also see what's happening at the same time. What's also great about Q-Take is you can pull those files in, and you can actually, until you get the dailies, the actual physical dailies, you can start cutting with them. And I can't tell you how often that was incredibly helpful, especially if I was dropping in shots. Like second unit could send me something and I could just drop it into something that we've done with first unit, and vice versa. And there were times when I would take the Q-Take files and build something so that Isaac could take a very, very quick look at it. And it created more work, of course. I mean, the assistants, if you talk to the assistants, they were like, "Oh my God," because they're bringing in regular dailies and trying to prepare the regular dailies, right? Meanwhile, I'm asking them to pull Q-Take files in so that I can start working with those. So it's a lot for them, but I got to tell you, it was incredible to have that immediacy. If I needed to build something very quickly for Isaac to put his eyes on because he was maybe shooting additional material for that scene, I could build something very, very quick for him to take a look at it.
It certainly sounds like if you're an editor working on location, why wouldn't you work that way? It just sounds like an incredibly efficient way of speeding the process along if you are there on location.
It does, but it is a lot more work, a lot more, you spend a lot of time. I spent a lot of time looking at dailies, then looking at Q-Take, then cutting. And then if I cut something in Q-Take, then my assistants have to go back and overcut with the actual dailies. And then I have to go back and look at it and make adjustments. So the thing that I would say about Q-Take with film, however, there were moments where, because we were shooting film, the film would have rollouts like back in the day, when film ran out and you had to reload, whereas Q-Take would still record. So there were moments where I was like, I know I saw that shot. I know I saw this moment. And then I'd find like, oh yeah, the camera roll ran out. I was like, oh, okay. Well, yeah.
There's something to be said for digital. When was the last time you caught a movie that was shot on film?
Oh my God. I can't even tell you. I can't tell you the last time that it was like an all film, like a show, honestly. I mean, I feel like I've had moments where they've shot like something, like a piece of something, a section, but I would really have to go back and look at my IMDb to kind of like figure out when that last time was, but it's been a minute.
You mentioned your amazing assistant crew and the different aspect to their roles in a film environment, in a Q-Tech environment, in a big visual effects type film. How that affects your assistants, and I guess also how it affects you.
I think that both in the pre-production stages and as soon as I can have them on with me, because often when you're doing previses, depending on the schedule and stuff, you're kind of a little bit on your own with that, though, they get involved as quickly as I can get them involved. I would say that during production, and especially during the time that we were back waiting to start back up again, and we were relying heavily on, to some degree, adjusting previses and storyboards until we had the footage. There was a lot of engagement with them because I still had them building temp sound effects. I still had them building this kind of sonic landscape with the storyboards and with the previses. At a certain point, we gave everybody a character voice to just kind of help temp in some of the dialogue that was from the script so that at least we could put some kind of life. It really helped Isaac as we were watching the movie, not just to have storyboards that we were reading. So we created this little theater troupe of voices with our crew because we were just doing whatever we could to build the film as best we could. And so that kept them busy. I mean, Corinne was kind of corralling all of that. And there were times when Isaac would be like, well, can we get this person to read this line from the script? And then, Corinne would go over to knock on the door. And, so aside from their regular jobs, they were doing that. And they were just making sure that we just kept the film alive. And Skywalker was really, really helpful with that as well. They started sending us a lot of their early kind of ideas about, each tornado. We really wanted, of course, to give its own character, their own personality, that sense of, I don't think we looked at them all as monsters, but, we did see this as a monster movie. And that's why we love so much the whole use of Frankenstein and all of it coming to life. And Isaac really loved the parallel of the two. So the assistants definitely kept busy. I would say having our visual effects editor with us on location, Warren Hickman, was invaluable. I mean, he started building things very early on. He created what we called tornadoes because I needed to be able to put tornadoes in shots with respect to, is it over there on the right? Is it moving left to right? Is it moving right to left? So I had a whole little kit of tornadoes. And I would just drop them on. And until, the visual effects started kind of giving us their own tornadoes, the tornadoes were very essential to the process.
Well, hearing you describe the tornadoes and where they should be placed reminds me of a question I often ask about action in general, and that is spacing of elements. Like when you're working in an action sequence, there's so much going on. You want to keep the audience excited, but also properly orientated so that it doesn't feel like there's something wrong with the geometry of the scene. And in something like Twisters, where stuff's flying around constantly, is that liberating that you don't have to worry about that so much, or is it harder and that you do have to worry about it that much more?
A little bit of both. There has to be a certain discipline in the chaos because at a certain point, I felt like I was coming in and having to have amnesia every day and forget what I know or what I learned about tornadoes or all of it. Cyclonic, anticyclonic tornadoes, were they turning clockwise or counterclockwise and why? And then at a certain point, you realize that the audience isn't going to necessarily be attuned to that. But we also had to kind of speak to those people in the audience who would hold us to task, the meteorologists, the science people, and they were on set. I mean, there was a very, very deliberate desire to be as accurate as we could about the science of it all. And so for me, I just felt like in some ways it was fun being chaotic, because if I could watch it and I could follow it, even if, direction was being changed or lines were being jumped or all of that, if I could follow it, then I felt like the audience could follow it. So if after going in and doing the surgical work of when the tornado dropped down and which direction it was moving and what direction the cars were moving and when they were being kind of flipped around and all of it, if I could step out and keep track of what the character was doing, I felt like I'd be okay. So that was kind of the way we approached it, is that we had to, I'm trying to think specifically, like one of the tornadoes that was maybe the most challenging with respect to, like you're saying, kind of the craziness of it. But at the same time, it was somewhat liberating.
Well, I'll tell you, the tornado that got me thinking about that was the rodeo tornado, I'll call it.
Yeah. The thing about the rodeo tornado was that tornado was important on a lot of levels. A story level, it was important because it was going to be the first tornado that Kate would be so immersed in that it would take her back to her memory of the first one. Like that was the one that was going to say, okay, you're back. Like she first gets back in Oklahoma, and yeah, the first tornado she sees, she's kind of spooked just because it's like, I haven't done this in a minute, right? That was tornado 4. You're talking about the pool tornado. That really not only rocks her to remembering that sense of loss and devastation, but it's also the first time we see Tyler shook. So, but that tornado was really important. Now, from a technical standpoint, the intention was always to do that tornado at a certain point in one shot. From an audience perspective, we were not going to cut, and that we were going to take you down in that pool and you were going to feel what it was like in real time to experience a tornado of that magnitude come at you. And so there was a lot of choreography, talk about a camera team and a visual effects team, an editorial team really working in cadence with one another. That was definitely Tornado 4, because all of the pieces that came together to make it feel like it was a seamless oneer, we all had to really kind of work together. We spent a lot of time in visual effects meetings working with the choreography of what the intention was. And that's a perfect example of being in a position where when you're on set or when you're on location and those decisions are being made and being kind of structured and choreographed, from an editing standpoint, it was really important because that was like a scene that also started off as previs and needed to make sure that the timing and the lenses and everything were going to be the right thing. And then ultimately someone has to put that together so that we can take a look at it. And obviously we were really, really happy the way it turned out.
I was looking at an interview with, I think it was Rachel Levy, who's the music supervisor, and she was talking about showing artists footage as inspiration for what they were writing. When you have this big soundtrack album that you're also working with, does that change the needle drop process at all?
Not necessarily. I mean, we still started the same way that I always start, which is we build the scene. And then ultimately, a lot of the early music that came in, I mean, Isaac, having grown up in Arkansas, he has a love for all kinds of music. So in many ways, the initial presentation of the film and what we started to build upon was based on a number of things. It was based on music that Isaac liked, based on things that I had kind of listened to and liked and thought, oh, well, this will be fun to try in our early editorial stages. And a lot of it was also what the Universal Music Department, Rachel, was providing us to say, hey, how about try this? Like we would get every couple weeks just this kind of lovely package of a lot of different artists, things that had been released, some things that had not been released yet, but then ultimately were released. But what it allowed us to do was it allowed us to have a little bit of freedom in putting and trying things that we liked, and also artists that Isaac liked. And then they were also providing different songs from those same artists. And then as we started to continue to go down the road and had more of a substantial film to kind of journey through, right, as a complete thought, it really started getting excited because then it was a time where the music department could start going out to artists and they would have conversations, come in and have conversations with Isaac and, our producers, Ashley Sandberg, she was practically there with us every day, which was lovely. And Doug Sook, who was associate producer. So there was a lot of conversations in the cutting room, and Rachel and Mike Knobloch would come through, and the Universal Music Department, they would stop in and we would talk a lot about what type of music Isaac liked, what he wanted to hear. And then at a certain point, they started to kind of reach out to artists, and I would build a little section of a sequence that Isaac felt was ready to go out, because you really want to make sure that the first time you put things out, you only have one chance to make a first impression. And the assistants were oh my gosh, they were so integral in that too, because a lot of times they were helping to build these things and sending them out and tracking them and the whole thing. But the best part of it was when these artists would see something in the film and it would inspire them to write a song. And then the song would come into us, and we had amazing music editor, Lisa Richardson, and Lisa would drop these songs on the scenes, and it was like the movie was just taking on a whole new life. And you just you knew when that right song came in and you dropped it in. And there were times, honestly, Matt, where we wouldn't have to do anything. And maybe it was because, the temp that we had in had been working, but I don't remember having to do a lot of adjusting to the songs. I think it was more Lisa would find the right kind of approach for the song in the scenes, and she was really great at it. And it was just so exciting every time something came in by an artist who had seen the film, and not even see the whole film. Like often it was just them seeing maybe a little bit of a sizzle type of thing. And then we would give them a section of the scene that we were looking to have a song in. And they just would come through with the most incredible approaches to the music. And we just got excited every time. I still remember Megan Mulroney's song coming in for the first time. And there was Miranda Lambert's song. There was Luke Combs' song. There were just so many great ones. Jelly Roll's song came through. Lainey Wilson's, oh my gosh. For us, it was kind of like Christmas. Every time a new song came in, it felt like our movie. It was great.
Well, this feels like a question I've probably asked you before, but do you prefer to cut without music first and then see how it works and then refine it? Or do you like to have the music and then work with the music?
I mean, sometimes if I'm cutting something, I might have music in the background playing. I find that generally I like to kind of cut the scene, not with any particular song in mind, but then sometimes I'll get to a point in the cut where I'm like, I need to hear something now. I'm close enough to what I'm looking to do in the scene that now I want to feel what it feels like to put something behind it, which is great. I mean, even something as simple as Tyler's team coming in for the first time and how they just kind of break the space and announce their presence. At a certain point, you kind of got the geography of all of it and how you want them to come in. And then you want to feel like, okay, what's going to be the right song to introduce Tyler Owens to this film? Like what's his hero entrance song? So like, Matt, what would be your hero entrance song? Like, right?
I don't know. We'll let people write in and suggest that.
I think that would be a good thing. Let's do a competition as to Matt Fury's hero entrance song.
Let's change the subject quickly. The pacing of the film, lots of action, lots of tornadoes and car chases. And then you have a break. You have her time at home and the reflection and getting to know Tyler better. And what you're doing is you're just setting up the momentum for the third act. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges in doing these big set pieces and certainly the big finish. But I would think that section there would be one of the more challenging in terms of the pacing of it and what you have to get in there to make sure you have the momentum going into the third act. Tell me about working on that section and the challenges you faced working on that part.
Well, I don't like to think of it as a break. I like to think of it as a breath, an exhale in the moment of the film, which a lot of people don't necessarily have patience for in these types of films. They just want to keep them moving and keep them quick. And, I had a genuine, I don't want to say the word concern, but I mean, I was aware that we were going to ask the audience's grace and what we called Real 5. And that we would maybe test the patience of certain audience members who would just don't necessarily want that kind of exhale. But I also knew that I knew the filmmaker I was working with. I knew what type of film he was making, and that within the spectacle that you had to care and you had to have a moment to process, and you had to give Tyler a moment to make his transition to being, the guy that ultimately, if we've done our job right, you really fall in love with at the end of the movie. Real 5 is when I fall in love with Tyler. Up until 5, I'm just like, okay, guy, you're funny and cocky and you're that guy. But then you really start to feel like, well, no, there's more to Tyler. And that's what I love about Real 5. And yes, it was challenging, Matt, because I got to tell you, it's many people's and certainly my favorite reel because the layers are peeled back in such a way that, again, you're asking for the audience's patience, getting to know characters where sometimes they don't necessarily gravitate. Like they just want to keep things moving. So it was a challenge, and it was something that we were kind of going back and looking at every time and making sure that even within the time that we were taking, that we were being efficient about it, that we were still keeping some kind of underlying tension and purpose to taking that moment. I would say that it was as challenging as cutting any of the other sections of the movie because you knew what you were doing and you knew that you would have to move through it as efficiently as possible, but hopefully that you had built enough around it and certainly leading up to it with just the relentlessness of the first 4 tornadoes that by the time we got to Tornado 5, that maybe audience was ready to take a little bit of a moment too.
Well, I think the audience grows weary of scenes like that when it's not working. And in this case, it worked because the pacing was right and the information was right and the emotional beats were right. I'm so glad you said that was one of your favorites because it brings me to a question I've been dying to ask you. Isaac's been out on the circuit promoting the film, talking about the process of making it. And he brings up a scene. It's the infamous Glenn Powell wet t-shirt in the rain scene. You're nodding your head already like, okay, here we go. And Isaac said, I tried to reduce that scene. I trimmed it down. And my editor at one point said, you have been requested to please restore the full length of that shot or else there will be a mutiny. To which Isaac then asked, who made this demand? And his editor, the great Terilyn Shropshire, responded, the ladies.
Well, in any film, there is times when you are looking to kind of, as I say, concentrate the film. Look at places where are we being a little indulgent? We have to be kind of the toughest and most ruthless with ourselves. And you don't want anyone to be harder on you than you are on yourselves. And there's so much of the process where you just have to kind of go in and go, okay, let's just try some things and see how far we want to go and how far we want to pull back and all of that. So the scene with Tyler coming out of the house after having a bit of a disagreement with Kate was one of those moments where I'm a big proponent of letting characters move through space. Sometimes there is a tendency, can we just get them to the other side of the door? Or can we just get them across the room? And the answer is yes, you can. But there are also times when it's okay for them to take the walk. There's a reason for them to take the walk. And in this case, there was a moment where Isaac at one point said, well, maybe we could tighten this up, and just kind of get him into the car. And I said, okay, well, I say what I say to all my directors, even though I may have a different opinion. I'll say, let's try it, because you have to. You can't just push back. I mean, I guess you could, but then they're always going to wonder. So it's like, okay, let's try it. Let's tighten this thing up, see what it looks like. And we did. And then I think we kind of do what we always do. We let it sit. We're like, okay, let's keep moving, the next one. And then we kind of start turning things over to our crew, our assistants, and so they can start cleaning up the sound and when we've made cuts and that kind of thing. And I started to get this kind of vibe where people were like, well, why did you shorten that? And I said, well, our director, he wanted to, see what that looked like. And there was just a lot of dissent, because often my assistant, because I give them the freedom to do that, the team, I'm like, you guys, we're not Emperor's New Clothes here. Got to let us know how you're feeling. When you see stuff, let us know what you're thinking. And they did. So at some point, Isaac and I were working on something and I just kind of said, well, I got to tell you, I'm getting some feedback from the crew. about the scene. And, Isaac, who's very receptive and has an amazing sense of humor. He was like, well, who is, and I was teasing him, but, there was dissent. And so that's how it happened that I said, yeah, the ladies. And he laughed. He said, okay, well, put it back. And so we put it back, and, you got to sometimes just, that's why we're there. We're there to give perspective, and he's there to give me perspective. And then the crew's there to give us perspective. And so they're our audience. And sometimes you just got to listen to your audience.
Somebody else who has perspective is Steven Spielberg. There's another scene that's been discussed, and that is the kiss that never came at the end of the movie. And apparently it was shot, like there was a kiss. And then I think it was credited to Spielberg that it would say more to not have the kiss at the end.
Yeah, I didn't really feel that was something that came out of our interaction with Steven, which, by the way, was amazing. He's just, look, he's Steven Spielberg. And the thoughts that he gave us and his perspective on moments of the film, it was just so refreshing to have notes from a filmmaker who speaks and communicates and expresses from a fellow filmmaker's perspective. It was amazing. And I have nothing but love for that man. But I think that really what came out of, and look, we could do a whole other podcast on romantic comedies and love stories and where we've evolved to. And I'd be happy to do that with you, Matt, anytime.
Noted.
But for the purpose of Twisters, I feel like we spent a lot of time really kind of watching the film as a whole with both. And I think that in some ways, the audience was the first kind of indication, our early audience introduction to the film. It was almost as if people kind of felt like they didn't necessarily, that it wasn't something that was necessarily lifting them at the end of the film. It's almost like I felt that there were times where people were kind of feeling that it was something predictable. And so we tried both. And what was interesting about when we took the kiss out, in some ways, it kept the film unpredictable to the end. Like, people are sometimes disappointed that their expectations were met, if that makes any sense. When we took it out and we gave them that moment of, well, we're just going to defer this for a second, because the love that they have for one another comes out of the love that they have for the weather, that mutual excitement and adrenaline of going to chase the next storm. And I think that in some ways it allowed the audience the imagination. Maybe they just walked right out to the truck, pulled up the augers, and had a kiss in the car. Maybe they went out and chased that storm and afterward had a great night. Who knows? We don't always have to wrap everything up in a nice little bow. I think that the beautiful thing about film is discovering and allowing your imagination to take you beyond maybe even what the filmmaker would give you. You leave wondering a lot more about Kate and Tyler, and,
You just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Well, I do try to wrap things up in a nice little bow if I can. And that usually comes in the form of asking the editor, a number of questions, but one of them is your favorite scene from the film to work on. Now, we've already talked about your affection for Reel 5, so maybe we know the answer already, but I'll give you another shot at it. What was your favorite scene from the film to work on?
There's so many moments. I think I really loved the moment where Tyler takes Kate out with the barrels and shows her a tornado, the way he sees a tornado. And ultimately, we see Kate rediscovering her wonder of nature and of Oklahoma and of the tornado. So I would say that what we call the date tornado, Tornado 5, where she looks up, she's in the tornado and she's just looking at it with that sense of wonder, was one of the fun moments to do. And I would also say that Tornado 3, where we literally go from them racing and kind of splitting off and then the whole thing coming down on Kate and Javi, that one was a fun one. There were so many, Matt. Obviously the theater was like, how can you not love the theater?
It was a big finish. And how can you not love going to the theater when you have movies like Twisters to go see? And I appreciated going to see it. I love talking to you about it like I always do. And I get a mental note, rom-com podcast with Teri coming up.
Let's do it. Here we go. That's it.
How about that, Teri Shropshire? Love having her on the show. And why not? She does great work and is always so much fun to talk to. And I am looking forward to the next time we get to do that. A big F5 tornado-sized thank you to her for talking with us today and sharing her talent and her love for editing. Say, do you love editing? I'm pretty sure you do, otherwise why would you put up with me? So since we both know you love editing, fall in love with it all over again by checking out the latest release of Avid Media Composer. If you are keeping score at home, that would be version 2024.6. In it you will find a more powerful phrase-find toolset featuring the new transcript tool, which displays an automatic transcription of your source clips that you can even use to edit. You just highlight the lines of dialogue you want and then drop them into the timeline. Oh, it's so easy. Plus, there are other cool new things when it comes to working with audio and Pro Tools. How do you find out more about all this? Well, you could ask around in the chat rooms of the dark web, or you could just click that link in the show notes and get it done in one step. So take a big step toward being a happier editor with all the latest in Media Composer. Okay, time for me to go. You can stay, just lock up when you leave. We will do this again soon, I am sure. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.